Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Equifax webinar, the UI Balancing Act, presented by Government Executive Media Group. I'm Juan Cole, and I'm the Vice President for Equifax's Government Services Group, and I will be your moderator for today. In today's webinar, we'll explore how state and federal leaders can aid citizens in this time of crisis while at the same time sharing ideas to minimize claim processing times and maximize program integrity. Go to the next slide, please. So the UI safety net is truly stressed. There's a couple figures on here we'll just chat about very quickly, but since around March, we've seen about 70 million UI claims. A large number of individuals who are receiving benefits today are actually in what we might call sort of a temporarily unemployed state, in the sense that they're returning or expecting to return back to work. And that number, which at least in April was around 80%, is now down to about 68%. That's a difficult population because of the fact that it's hard to know when they have actually returned back to work. Historically, that number is somewhere in the 10% area. The other thing that's interesting is we've seen that because of the fact that for the first time we're actually providing benefits to self-employed, we see that, and again, another population which is a much larger population than historically, also seeking benefits, and then very difficult to find those individuals have actually returned back to work. So these are just a couple of the challenges, and obviously, the government through the CARES Act and a number of other programs has provided funding to try to assist the states through this very difficult time. What you'll note, obviously, and I think it's been talked about quite a bit, is because of the level of funding, it has introduced also a lot more complexities and the introduction of fraud. So if we go to the next slide, please. So just to put it in perspective, in 2019, we had around 10% improper payments. And so if you extrapolate that or you apply the same calculations to the over 260 billion in additional funding that we have out there today, that turns out to be about $26 billion of potential improper payments that that we're seeing across the industry. Again, that's a potential. And you look at looking at 2019, there's about 3% fraudulent payments. If you apply again that same figure, we're now looking at about 8 billion in fraudulent payments. And if you bring all the factors we just talked about a couple minutes ago together with these figures, you can easily see how difficult this time is for the states, those that administer the benefits, and how challenging it is and will continue to be based on the tools that are available. So if we can go to the next slide, please. What I'd like to do is, rather than me reading out the bios for those individuals that have joined our panel, and we have an excellent panel of experts from diverse federal and state government areas, as well as the private industry, I'll let them each introduce themselves, and then what we can do is jump directly into questions for the panels and get into some discussions. So we can go ahead and exit out of that, and then Mason, if I can ask you to start off, I'd appreciate it. I don't know if Mason's on mute. Well, let me do this then. Let me go ahead and go to you, Matt. We'll start off with you.
Okay, thanks, Juan. My name is Matt Whitinger. I'm the resident fellow, a Rowe fellow in poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Currently, I suspect, like Mason, working from the home office in Northern Virginia, like probably most people are. I spent 28 years prior to arriving at AEI 2 years ago working on Capitol Hill. For the bulk of that time, I was the Republican staff director of what was then known as the Human Resources Subcommittee, but for today's purposes, it's the subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee in the House that had jurisdiction over unemployment insurance. So suffice to say, sort of long-running experience and interest in the operation of the UI program and the people who benefit. So thank you. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. Mark, can you introduce yourself? I know that.
Yes, I'm Mark Butler. I'm a labor commissioner here in Georgia. I've been in this position, which, by the way, it's an unusual position here because it's elected in the state of Georgia. And I've been here for about the last 11 years. I'm in my third term. Before that, I served about 8 years in the General Assembly, but most importantly, for 20 years, I helped run my family's small business out in West Georgia. So I've kind of seen the process from both sides of the angle. And so we have had a difficult time during this year here, and I hope to get into this discussion to find out why this has been such a difficult process for the last 5 to 6 months.
Great, thanks, Mark. And then obviously, last but certainly not least, Kevin, if you can introduce yourself.
Certainly. My name is Kevin Burt. I work for the State of Utah Department of Workforce Services Unemployment Insurance Division Director. The Department of Workforce Services is one of the largest state agencies in the state and has centralized a lot of the safety net programs as well as the Workforce Development Division to kind of coordinate all of those and be a one-stop shop. Unemployment insurance specifically deals, of course, with the benefit issuance as well as the tax rate calculation and collection for the employers. And I've been with the department for about 18 years.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it. And I had the pleasure of working with Kevin. Got to meet with him a number of occasions, I think, out in his state. So, gentlemen, I think we'll all agree that about a year ago, none of us would think that we would be having the type of discussions that we're having today and trying to figure out how to address this UI scenario that has unfolded over the past 7 months. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start our questions. Matt, I'll start with you if I can ask you a question. So what do you hear from and this is like a multi-part question, so I'll read it all, and if we need to go back and read any part of it, please let me know. But what do you hear from your former colleagues on the Hill? What are they hearing from the states? What do you think the next round of funding will address, and where do you predict it might end up?
Well, that is a multi-part question. So I think my former colleagues on the Hill recognize that the states are overwhelmed, and that's one part is just sort of the nature of the pandemic and the responsibilities that's been given to the UI program. And another part is that sort of federal tasking of UI agencies with being a main and major source of income support for people. Like you said, no one, I think, on a call like this last year would have ever contemplated that the UI program would be dispensing $600 payments on top of regular unemployment benefits. Yet here we are. Some of, I think, what's going on is UI program has basically been given a task that is a poor fit for the unemployment insurance program historically. So you have a program that generally is designed to provide wage replacement, partial wage replacement to people who are permanently unemployed. In the meantime, it's been used to sort of provide significant income support to people who are temporarily unemployed due to a pandemic. I think where we're sort of trending in terms of the discussion now is we're going from shutdowns and paying people to stay out of work and not interact with one another to sort of questions about what are some of the more normalized behaviors of the system going forward. And there you have to sort of start looking at, well, what are the things that were really unique in the response that has been, run through the UI program. So that includes things like the PUA program, which has suffered from significant fraud and abuse. And a large part of that is because of kind of the design of that program. So letting people self-certify for work, more broadly than just PUA, but including in PUA, waiving work search requirements. In the UI side of things, waiving experience rating, allowing people in PUA to sort of establish their eligibility based on things like can't go to work because your kid's home from school. So I think where the policy response on the Hill is going to trend is in response to some obvious questions, right? Like what to do about the 600 what to do about the end of year questions that are sort of built into the legislative response so far. So does PUA continue beyond the end of the year? Do more weeks of benefits get added for the long-term unemployed? And then how do you deal with some of the major fraud and abuse issues, or does Congress even want to tackle some of the major fraud and abuse issues that are sort of endemic in the design of things like PUA? I don't really have a great crystal ball. I suspect they will not address things like the 600 ultimately before the election, and that'll get kicked into the lame duck. And then some of that response, whether it's in December or more in January, is really going to be determined by who's in charge on Capitol Hill and in the White House. So your guess is as good as mine. I'm not going to opine on that in this session.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Let's get back to Mason. I think we ran into some audio challenges, but Mason, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll have a question for you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. So I'm actually at my house in rural Maine, and because of the digital divide, I called in through my phone, so had to unmute on the computer, even though I'm using my phone. So hopefully you can hear me now okay. Real quick, and really what I have to sort of add initially here really builds on what Matt just talked about, which is my way of background. I've been involved in workforce development higher ed for over 25 years, first in Utah. Helped create the Utah Department of Workforce Services, actually, and it's good to see Kevin on the call. And then ended up in D.C. as the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Employment Training Administration. So unemployment insurance was one of my portfolios that I had to kind of oversee, and was there during the 9/11 response. So we had not to the same extent as COVID, but had a similar kind of emergency response, having to use the UI system, and was somewhat overwhelmed at that point. There are many of us, and I dare say Matt and I are a couple of them, that have called on significant reforms to the UI program. And what I like to say is that, unfortunately, it's a New Deal program in an iPhone economy. And I think we're seeing some of the struggles of that with the COVID response. On the one hand, while it is somewhat unrealistic to expect the system to be able to handle the influx that it did, on the other hand, it's a system that has been in dire need of significant reforms now, in my opinion, for quite a few years. And I think what COVID's done is kind of ripped the Band-Aid off of that wound, frankly. I think when it comes to this discussion, there are obviously short-term and longer-term implications and policies. I would say that in the short term, Matt brought up the PUA and the fraud and those sorts of things, and I was somebody who actually issued some opinion memos early on around trying to provide more flexibility, and I do believe the Department of Labor is trying to allow states some level of flexibility around being able to serve self-employed. But again, the fact that we're dealing with this with PUA is because there has not been a recognition by policymakers over the last couple of decades that self-employment and that kind of work was a growing and larger portion of our economy, and that many of those people are not covered under the traditional UI system. So I think that the PUA issue is one that begs for a more responsible structuring of the UI system. The other thing I would just add too, I think is part of this discussion, is really what is the role of public-private partnerships when it comes to the unemployment insurance system. And I'll just put out there that if you look at the response to COVID, whether it be the therapeutics, the vaccines and such, it was not the government itself doing all of that work. They fostered and partnered with private sector companies to be able to develop those, invest in the development of those therapeutics, invest in the development of the vaccine. So I think that one opportunity that we ought to really think about, we can touch on today, but longer term is there a bridge between the public and private sectors and a recognition of the way that work is being restructured in the United States? And can the public and private sectors come together to sort of have a coordinated response to helping individuals who become unemployed through no fault of their own, regardless of whether they're a W-2 or a 1099 type of employment arrangement? I would just add the other thing too real quick, is that I think it's been unfortunate that in a couple of states that they've used this opportunity to sort of what I would foster a political agenda around the issue of classification of workers. And I think it's been very unfortunate, to the detriment ultimately of the people who need unemployment assistance, that some of those political things have been playing out in using this pandemic unemployment response. And so I think we need to try to not do that in these instances. And for the workers and employers, I think it's much better if we sort of deal with those in other forms and not using the UI system as the means to do that.
Great. Thanks, Mason. And I think something you mentioned early on was around how the states, do have control over how they administer the programs, and I think that flexibility is important to many of the states. I want to try to bring Mark in here if I can. And first of all, Mark, as a company, Equifax is headquartered in Atlanta, and we take great pride in doing what we can to help our neighbors. Can you tell us a little about Georgia and how it's dealt with the influx of claims? And as a follow-up, what sort of help are you anticipating or would you like to see from the federal government?
Well, those most dangerous words in the English language for the federal government, we're here to help, but we'll get to that in just a minute. We did some unique stuff here in Georgia. And quite frankly, if all we had to have dealt with during this crisis was just regular UI, what we've been doing for decades, I think we'd have seen very few bumps. I think we'd have done just fine. I think it'd been fairly smooth. One of the unique things that we did here in Georgia that I'm not certain, but I don't think any other state attempted, is we took a system that was primarily used for temporary shutdowns that in the past you mainly just saw manufacturers and certain other industries use. We call it partial claims here, which is probably a misnomer. It's a system where the employer files on the behalf of their employees in the case of a temporary shutdown. Well, in the very beginning, when we were led to kind of believe, or we thought that maybe it was just going to be a very temporary situation, and that we will only be shut down for a few weeks, this might be something we might try to push out for everybody. So we insisted to a certain extent for all businesses to file on behalf of their employees. And the system worked very well in the very beginning, not without a few bumps and bruises, because we never tried to do it on this scale. But roughly about, I think around 80 or 85% of all claims were filed by their employers. And the reason why that's important is when the employer files on behalf, they're already basically, self-attesting that this person does deserve unemployment. They do work for us. And so it really takes about 2/3 of the work out of the process. And those claims we were able to pay, unless there was some other type of issue on that particular person, in about 7 days, which is, kind of lightning fast when you consider the amount of claims coming in. Our biggest issue has been with the additional stuff that was passed in the CARES Act. It would have been really nice if Congress would have picked up the phone and called a few states and got some input about what that's going to look like. How would that be pulled off? I've heard a lot of people say, well, it's because your aging system. No, it's because we're dealing with a system that had never been dealt with before. The PUA system is just, quite frankly, just in my opinion, obviously I'm going to be a little harsh here, but it was not very well thought out. I mean, it was just kind of hey, here we go. Let's just put this out there. And it is right for attempted fraud, the way it's put together. And quite frankly, our hands are tied in some cases about when we see things and we go, gosh, this doesn't look right, but here's what the rules say. So we just kind of go this direction. But PEUC was also, to me, very detrimental. And it's been very hard on us to kind of get a handle on, because you're going all the way back to last July and taking a look at anybody that was unemployed. Both those two programs have really caused about 90% of our issues. Even though we do have an older UI system technology-wise here, we've done a very good job updating it and implementing new programs and building these new programs. So that really hasn't been the issue. The issue has been, I think, quite frankly, from a policy side. When you take unemployment systems around the nation, which have been largely ignored for the last 10 years, and funding is at a all-time low, and that's something we should probably get into in this discussion, is how it's funded. It's funded based on claims, not on the size of your workforce. I think that needs to be looked at, because when something bad happens, you may be in a state like Georgia, whose economy was just going at light speed, and had the lowest amount of claims that we'd seen since the 1970s. And that's what our funding was based on from the feds. And then we get hit. Obviously, we're going to have a lot larger number of individuals impacted by something like this. And then you're basically, having to flip a switch overnight. And quite frankly, all the money in the world coming out of DC at the last minute is really not helpful in what we do. I mean, it is in the long, maybe in the long term, maybe kind of. It helps you pay for things that you've got to go out and grab real quick. But the thing that you can't replace is experience. And you can't grow experience and hire experience for what we do in the middle of a pandemic, especially since you're competing against unemployment that in a lot of cases exceeds what all your starting salaries are out of the group that you're trying to hire in. So, I mean, those are the types of challenges that we've dealt with. What I hope from the feds is they need to take a look at the funding that they've given us and probably extend it a little bit longer, because I mean, there's some of the stuff has deadlines on it that I don't think are realistic, because we're going to be dealing with a fallout from for these systems for the next several years, and we need this money to continue to stay here for us to unwind some of this and to take a look at how it is, because we've got mountains of things we've got to go through that we haven't been able to get to yet. They need to be looked at, whether it's fraud or other issues, and we got a ways to go. What I hope they don't do is give us a whole bunch of new programs that are totally different than what we've already had to contend with. We don't need anything new, because it's just a lot.
Well, thanks, and thanks for your insights. I'm going to move now to Kevin, but I wanted to thank both you and Kevin and your organizations for what I know has been a significant amount of work that your staff has gone through. I think I've had multiple conversations with the IT teams that have talked about maybe having a weekend off, once in over a 2-month period, just on the basis of, like you said, all the changes that they needed to implement from a policy perspective into the system. So truly appreciate the work that you and your teams and staff have done for the citizens in your states. Let's go ahead and go over to Kevin. And Kevin, it's the same question for you. Thanks again also for being a customer of Equifax and for utilizing some of our services, particularly the Work Number. And we've always, I think, had a good relationship with you. But I'd like to understand. Again, the same thing as we asked Mark. Tell us a little bit about how Utah has been dealing with the influx of claims. And what sort of help or are you anticipating, or would you like to see from the federal government as it pertains to the way that you do you process claims in your state?
Thanks, and I think Mark did an excellent job kind of summarizing it. I think that in the end, there's been a lot of talk about the UI system is outdated and wasn't ready to be able to handle it. I'm with Mark in that I believe that the UI system was prepared to be able to handle just a regular claim, but the CARES Act just introduced so many programs that have never been implemented before. And then as Matt mentioned, it relied on the unemployment system to create a stimulus and get to a full replacement wage, which only amped up the demand and changed the way that possibly that employers were responding to the pandemic and how they would treat their employees, because they knew that they would find security and full replacement in the unemployment insurance benefit. And so there was this immediate overwhelming demand. You added a stimulus to it, which only increased the demand. And then you introduced these new programs that had never been administered before to cover people that had never traditionally been eligible for unemployment. And then all these safety net programs that historically had been used to help people, all of them shifted to now be supported exclusively by unemployment insurance. And just the demand was significantly overwhelming. I think the other thing that I guess I would add that Mark didn't mention is we were dealing with the pandemic ourselves as an employer. We had centralized. We had all of our staff in a single building because we felt that was the best way to manage it. We had gone primarily to an online environment, which had been excellent. But now you have all of your staff centralized in one large building in downtown Salt Lake, in Utah's case.
Yeah.
If you had an outbreak there, you had, not only did you have this demand, you'd lose all your experienced staff. So the first thing that we had to do was immediately start ramping up the use of telework to be able to keep people isolated, keep people distanced, and keep people working. And I think that added to the challenge of it as well. It wasn't just a matter of responding to the demand, it was changing your work environment to keep your staff safe and functioning so that they could respond to the demand. And I think that added a significant challenge, being that it was a health pandemic, not just an economic complicated or an economic recession.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you'd like to see coming out of the federal government now that I don't think that there's a law necessarily, right? But we seem to be in a position where people are able to get their feet back underneath them, right? It seems like that's the last month and a half, 2 months have been a little bit more like that, even though we're seeing an increase again, right? What are some of the things you'd like to see out of the federal government, or would like to ask the federal government to do differently as we move forward? And I realize that the change of administration is going to have a huge impact on that.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think I just kind of echo what Mark said. I think a lot of the programs that were passed in the CARES Act were complex, and they were difficult to figure out and to implement. And now that we have them existing and stood up, now it's a matter of how do you work with the people on those to be able to make sure that they're receiving it accurately and are being required to meet the requirements of the program. If unfortunately another bill is passed that completely turns around the direction of the programs, or creates new avenues, or creates just new programs, it unfortunately won't allow the state to master the administration. Like, in the end, yes, we've been doing unemployment for several decades, but we've been doing pandemic unemployment assistance for 6 months. And
Right.
So is there criticism of the program? Yeah, and its implementation, it's probably rightfully so, but it's only been 6 months. And so the states are adapting and adjusting to this new program, and to change the requirements on it, or to just add a completely different program, I think would just, all progress made over the last 6 months would unfortunately be wiped out. And again, remember, all these programs we had to administer, you're shifting staff that are able to process the workload to developing and deploying new programs, instead of focusing on the work. And so I would hope that they look at the value of the programs that have already been implemented, come up with the correct amount, but not alter them too much.
Good. Thank you very much. So, and I never thought I would use the word new normal again, right? Because I think we've heard that so much. But in reality, what you guys are looking for, it seems like, is to maintain the new normal, at least for the foreseeable future, so that it doesn't create more chaos or headaches for your organizations. I think that's what Mark was alluding to as well. So thanks a lot, Kevin. I appreciate that. So I want to shift now and talk a little bit about tools the government, maybe providing, or has brought on board to support the pandemic. I know that as we've talked to different government organizations, there's really at least 2 areas where we've seen that the type of tools that Equifax can provide, can help address this rampant fraud that we're seeing. And a high level, one of them is around the Work Number. For those that don't know, the Work Number has over 1 million employers that contribute payroll records every pay period. So obviously we have up-to-date pay data, if you will, and the database really helps prevent UI overpayments by determining ongoing eligibility when verifying both on a weekly or biweekly certification. Interestingly, as I mentioned before, the dynamic of being able to see when those who were quote unquote temporarily laid off are back to work, that's something that our database actually has the ability to do. And so the other thing is obviously the gig economy has introduced a significant number of independent workers or individuals who are or contractors, and I think having those records now is helpful in addressing a couple of those challenges that we talked about early on. The second area really is around fraud and identifying the fraud through account verification, and it's an interesting dynamic on how many individuals are receiving benefits to fraudulent accounts, if you will, right? And so the ability to actually bind the identity to the account is something that I think is new in this world that we need to actually try to address. And so there's some data sets around in the Equifax world that we think that that help to address this. What I want to try to do is again shift now to a couple questions for the panel, if you will. So with the discussion around tools in mind, and there's a recent GAO report on COVID-19 federal efforts noting that the Department of Labor, OIG, the Office of Inspector General, is undertaking an quote unquote a comprehensive effort to identify the types of UI fraud encountered by states, the tools states are using to detect UI fraud and improper payments, and their plans to recover repayments. I'd like to pose a couple questions around tools available to combat these challenges. And Mason, if I could start with you, the tools that the states are currently using don't seem to fully be up to the challenge, right, of either the initial eligibility or return work. I mean, I think we just talked about how so many policies have changed that there's a lot of challenges around being able to manage the workloads. And so the labor, what is it? The Employment and Training Administration recently issued guidelines or some guidance for the quality service plan, which talked about state use of UI Integrity Center resources with a particular focus on state connection to the Integrity Data Hub. Can you talk a little bit about these tools and when you think these tools will, in their current form, start to have a significant impact on improper payments?
Sure. Again, I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask this question because I am not there day to day and don't know all the nuts and bolts of what's happening. I will say this, generally speaking, kind of turning back to Georgia and Utah when it comes to tools, is that I think one of the challenges always is that what we've heard here is exactly what happens, and it not only happened in COVID, but it happens in other circumstances where emergency comes up. Again, we've sort of neglected longer term the tools and the systems that states need to be able to do the kinds of things they need to do. They get a whole bunch of new provisions like in the CARES Act dumped on them. And then now they have the IG and others coming in and saying, wait a minute, what have you not done right here? And it really puts the states in a very difficult situation. So I do think we need to understand that if Congress is going to do what Matt described very well, and then ask the Georgias, Utahs, and everybody else to then implement all of those given the circumstances, and then have the watchdogs come in afterwards and I hate to use the word punish them, then I think that would be the wrong approach. So what do we need to do? We need to use the UI data integrity tools and the other kinds of things that have been developed. Again, I'm not the best person to speak to those specifically and how those will actually be put into place. I think maybe Kevin and Mark could do a better job of that. I would just say that I do think we have to, the federal government should not play a gotcha role to the states on this and need to have a true partnership role to see what went wrong, how do we fix it? And again, my interests are more in the long term. So where do we go from here and not just play gotcha? So I will stop there and perhaps somebody else has some additional thoughts.
Yeah, Mark and Kevin, I mean, if you have some thoughts around that, love your input as well. Otherwise, I can move on to
Kevin, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thank you, Mark. I think that Mason's correct. I think that there are a lot of things in place to help with the integrity of the unemployment insurance program, but there were not those same features built into the pandemic unemployment assistance program. I remember unemployment insurance is an insurance that is taxed to employers and deposited into a trust fund to pay out employees of those employers that are covered and are unemployed through no fault of their own. The pandemic unemployment assistance was more of a stimulus type benefit to help individuals who were self-employed that hadn't contributed to the unemployment insurance program in the past, and were now applying for this stimulus benefit. It just happened to be run through the unemployment insurance divisions for the state because it was seen as a similar thing, and they kind of get meshed together. And so a lot of the protocols that are in place that really do help with the integrity of the unemployment insurance program for covered employees haven't adapted to how do you monitor that a person who is self-employed returns to work when those wages aren't reported to anybody, because no one has reported self-employment wages because they weren't eligible for unemployment insurance in the first place. And so I do think that I am hopeful that they do look at the policy when they're evaluating the future of the pandemic unemployment assistance if it's used in future recessions. But as far as the tools, yeah, I think that as we go to online, we certainly have to look at identity proofing, making sure that the person is who they say they are, and using that technology to be able, that technology resources that are available. And one thing that was mentioned is wage identification. Absolutely. I mean, for those unfamiliar with unemployment insurance, again, we have every employer in the state of Utah that has employees report those wages quarterly. We use that to determine a tax rate, and then we collect that tax to pay unemployment benefits. And so that is available quarterly to be able, and then we cross-match that, any wages reported, to verify if someone was receiving unemployment insurance fraudulently, and then we go and collect that. So any way to get that faster and prevent those payments from going out in the first place, because remember, identifying overpayments or fraud versus collecting on fraud are two different events. And so if you can prevent the payment from going out in error, it is always better than identifying it later and collecting it. It's not simply that, though. It's also make sure that the benefits go out correctly. The best way to avoid fraud is to only pay those that are eligible. And pandemic has proven, unemployment assistance has proven to be difficult in that. But then also customer education. I think that a lot of times what is seen as fraud is just a lack of understanding of unemployment. The pandemic resulted in a ton of people receiving unemployment insurance for the very first time. They had never experienced the program before. So there's lack of understanding. Well, do I report it when I get paid? Do I report it when I earn it? And so customer education up front is certainly critical as well, because it's not all fraud. It can just be misunderstanding the program or not understanding it.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, I mean, that's I mean, Kevin, you pretty much nailed it. The only thing that I would add is that, historically, we've done a really good job on regular UI as far as going after overpayments when there is some. And there's always going to be some, because, people don't pay attention to the rules. They don't read the rules. They think that, okay, I don't get paid 2 weeks, so I'm going to go ahead and get unemployment for the next 2 weeks till I get paid. No, that's not how it works. So we see those kind of things. The big challenge that we're going to have, and you talk about the partnership that Mason talked about between the feds and state, is the program that they created, PUA. I think that you're going to see a ton of not only just fraud, but overpayments there too. I mean, we're already, because the verification of income is somewhat of a manual process on some of the people, depending on the type of proof, for lack of a better word, that they use for income. When you go back in there, we're finding lots of instances where people have grossly overstated their income based on something they read on Facebook or something somewhere about how they should fill out the application to get the most money, because they don't think anything's going to happen. But I mean, we're going to be responsible for going after that. And some of it's going to be straight up fraud, because, this person knew they didn't make that kind of money. And, the odds of you getting that money back from a lot of those people are probably going to be slim to none. So that's going to be interesting to see how that kind of folds out. And we're already, as we go through that mountain of information that people sent in to us about, their income, and supposedly these receipts and things, or payments, or, we've even had to deal with fake 1099s that people have created. Of course, we've got a way to verify those now. But, quite frankly, the PUA thing just needs to go away. You can get unemployment as a self-employed. There is a way to do it. However, nobody ever does it. Well, not everybody. Some people do it. I know that when I was self-employed for 20 years, I paid unemployment taxes. I paid myself a regular paycheck, and I paid in my stuff. So if had I been in my old job when this hit, and my business had to shut down for a while, I could have filed unemployment based on the fact that I had been paying into the system. The system actually does work quite well, even as old as what it is, but the PUA system doesn't work, but mainly because it's very hard to verify. It's very, it's clunky at best, and that's giving it a compliment. Just not very well thought out. I think you've got a lot of people in Washington that came up with an idea that probably had very little touch points on the actual UI system and how it works. The type of information that we require, what goes into it, and just said, oh yeah, sure, we can just give it to this group over here, no problem. And here you can use all these different types of things, and it's been a problem.
Hey, Juan, this is Mason. Can I jump in on something that Kevin and Mark have both said that I think is important?
Absolutely.
A couple things. One is, Mark, I agree with you. Actually, I'm self-employed, but starting in 2014, I filed as an S Corp, so I pay myself a salary and pay self-employment taxes into the Virginia Employment Commission. So I know exactly what you're speaking of. But they both have brought up something about the self-employed that spurred a couple of thoughts that I think are really are sort of important. One is, I actually also umpire girls' high school softball in Virginia, and we are all 1099. So I had a number of individuals who relied on that income as a primary source of income, and I helped them with applying through the Virginia system. And I got to be honest, it was very confusing for people. It was very difficult. I didn't end up hitting the apply button, but I went through the process of the questionnaire myself. And there were simple questions like, who is your employer? And instead of people putting themselves, because they were putting like the Umpires Association or something like that. So even very simple things were difficult for people in the application process, which just then creates a mound of problems for the agencies themselves. The other thing I would say, too, that I think was really unfortunate, I think this is, again, something that Congress sort of lacks to do, which is I had some early conversations back in March and April with the Department of Labor about, look, I've got some folks that I know that we could stand up a PUA call center so that you don't put that burden on the states to figure out how to do this. They're being overwhelmed. And I actually think that one of the things we really need to do a much better job of if these kinds of things are going to get passed by Congress is, while we want to give states the flexibility, I also do think there's an appropriate support federally or nationally when we stand up a federal program like PUA. And it seems to me we ought to also provide resources so that maybe the Department of Labor could have a centralized call center. Just if nothing else, people needed somewhere to call. I mean, I helped people who had no idea what to do, who were in that kind of PUA situation. Again, Kevin mentioned the number of people who had never applied for UI that did this time. And I don't think we were in any way prepared to assist the states with the kind of back-end support they needed and left them on their own. And again, it just added up to the number of things that both Kevin and Mark have talked about that they were having to deal with it in a very short window of time. So.
Yeah, I didn't, as someone who's also umpired before, I think that the frustration of parents yelling at you is probably at a certain level. It sounds like what you went through is even at a level much higher than that. But so Matt, let me turn to you. I got a question, if you don't mind. So, I understand your research areas include poverty studies, safety net programs, and welfare reform, in addition to unemployment. It's a matter of fact that you were instrumental in drafting the 1996 welfare reform law. Clearly, poverty and unemployment are inextricably linked. At a federal level, do you see any movement to link UI and TANF or other benefit programs?
Well, thanks for the question. Mason and Kevin can talk about some of the linkages that Utah has made between TANF and UI. Where I kind of see the linkage, or at least the direction, going more on the federal level, especially if, let's say, there's a Democrat sweep in this fall's elections. I don't think it's about linking programs. I think it's about, for some policymakers, making the UI program a more national program, right? So there are proposals that have been introduced by folks like Senator Bennett from Colorado and Representative Beyer on the House side that say things like, well, states need to be compelled to raise their replacement rates. They should all add a dependent allowance. And that's in normal times. So the Bennett-Byer proposal from the spring said 75% replacement rates in all states. I'm not sure what Georgia's is right now, but I'm pretty confident it's not 75%, right? And what these proposals sort of envision is a system where the federal government's basically telling the states how to run the program, how much in benefits to pay, and then kind of leaving it to the states to determine how much in taxes they have to collect to support all those federal mandates. That strikes me as the bigger sort of trend and kind of concern that I think folks, especially at the state level, are going to have to deal with. And then also obviously the employers, right? Because anytime the federal government comes in and tells a whole swath of states, and you're talking red states, states with relatively lower wage bases that tend to have relatively lower benefit amounts, hey, you need to do more. You need to pay more benefits. That also means, especially in those states, employers are going to have to pay more payroll taxes, which means individuals, workers, are going to have to sacrifice more wages in support of those payroll taxes. So that's kind of the looming major change in the future. I suspect, to Kevin's points before, what Congress will do in the short term about PUA, whether it gets extended or amended, probably not that much change. Maybe some effort to assist states with some more money to combat fraud and abuse. Maybe some best practices about better identity verification, which lots of states are all doing. But I think the bigger concern in the longer term should be, what are some of the lessons that policymakers take from this pandemic experience and try to leverage those into the future design of the UI program? And a lot of those lessons are really poor fits because it's the same folks that said that $600 bonuses were really necessary, sort of saying, well, how can we shoehorn $600 bonuses or some proxy for that into the future normal operation of the UI program? And I think there's some real danger there.
Great. Thanks. Mark, we were just mentioning the Integrity Data Hub, and I was wondering, is Georgia currently using the Integrity Data Hub? If not, what does Georgia plan to do in order to use it by I think it's the March 31st date? And then just to extend that question a little bit, what do you think works well about the Integrity Data Hub, and what would you like to see improved based on your experiences thus far?
Well, I mean, yes, we are a participant on that, and but we're using lots of different things right now. We're using some private sector solutions, which I don't want to give out any ads or anything out there for anybody, but because one of the big issues we're having with everything being online, and also due to the fact that, and a lot of people don't realize this because you don't really hear much about it, but due to the fact that over the last, say, 10, 15 years or however long, you hear about all these different data breaches that happened at this place or that place or this company or this online or whatever. The fraudsters have incredibly good data on you. I mean, we've seen some famous individuals here in the Atlanta area that are household names have claims filed on them, and we know that they're not unemployed. One of them was just on TV this past Sunday. I won't give you any more hints other than that. But I can assure you they're not unemployed.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's stunning the type of data that the fraudsters are able to have. And I don't really know realistically in a pandemic how you can keep up with that on a real-time basis because things are moving so fast. You got to remember, at the same time, we're sitting there saying, you've got to be careful, we got to make sure we're not, paying people we shouldn't be paying. You've also got a twice as much pressure coming from the other side going, hey, you guys aren't paying people fast enough. You're not moving fast enough. These people are waiting. They're waiting too long. You've got to pay faster. You've got to move faster. And so, it's some, do you want it done right or you want it done, quick? I mean, yeah, the states, and I said this back in March and April. I said, we've got all this pressure coming from Washington and and also from our legislatures here locally to go fast. I said, you give it 9 to 8 months. These same people that are telling us to hurry up and pay are going to be going, how in the world did you pay all these people that you weren't paying? I mean, y'all weren't paying attention. Y'all must have been going way too fast and just let all this stuff get by. Then we're all going to get thrown under the bus. But like I said, 90% of it is going to come out of the PUA program. I can guarantee you. That thing is full of holes. All the integrity centers in the world, I don't think would have helped with some of that, but it definitely is going to help. Just like some of these online tools where we're verifying people's identity, because we've found some holes here in Georgia that we didn't know also existed outside of UI, where people have been able to access documentation and documents that we would have thought could not have been accessed. And I'm also not going to say that either because it's not a known thing, because we're trying to figure out how they're doing it.
Sure. Good.
Hey,
Thank you.
Juan, do you mind if I add something to that?
Sure, absolutely.
So yeah, the Integrity Data Hub has been great. So what the Integrity Data Hub does is it's basically a centralized portal for states to be able to submit its claims. So in the end, if Georgia identifies someone that has stolen identity and has been applying for unemployment fraudulently, they share that information with the Integrity Data Hub, so that same fraudster doesn't hit the state of Utah. And so as more and more states participate in it, I actually think that will be a good consequence of this amount of pressure that's been put on unemployment. All of these states starting to participate and starting to work together with that data sharing. And then what I'd like to just add with Matt, it would be really unfortunate to do massive changes to the program based on a pandemic. I think it's important to understand there's a difference between a pandemic and a recession. A lot of times we use this pandemic and we use the word unprecedented. And I think it fits. It really is unprecedented. But to build your model around an unprecedented event rather than your standard recession, I think would be unfortunate. I think the states have really done a good job being able to respond to recessions and accordingly and provide unemployment insurance as it was designed to provide with that partial replacement to be able to support some of the other safety net programs or supplement some of the other safety net programs that already exist. But now to change its purpose based on a pandemic, I think would be unfortunate. Some of the stimulus benefits certainly can be argued that they were needed during this pandemic, but needed during your standard recession. I think that might be unfortunate, removing that flexibility or control of the states and shifting it to a federal level.
Yeah. And Kevin, I know we only have, I think we're down to maybe 7 minutes or 6 minutes, but just listen to what you said before about how you've had to basically adjust and have your teams go from a centralized model to a decentralized model. Obviously that introduced, and I've been to your state, so I've seen how you guys have actually implemented technology to really make your programs work, from cradle to grave. But how's that changing the way you think now about how you would basically be able to take and maybe apply the same level of technology to the individuals that are applying for benefits to be able to have them be checked for identity, be checked for income and employment? Is that coming into play now for you? Because I know you guys are very automated. You're very technology centric on how you apply, your policies across the board.
Yeah, luckily, like I said, we have been pretty proactive at introducing technologies and hopefully on the forefront of that to some extent. I think it is incorrect to assume people who are applying for assistance still want in-person paper contacts. I think it is important to create that access point for electronic applications, but if you're going to do that, make sure that the simplicity of the application does not result in simplicity of fraud. You have to find that balance of making sure that you still have those quality checks to prevent, because again, creating access can create fraud, and so you have to adjust. If you're going to introduce electronic access, you also have to certainly maximize the tools that are available to find fraud electronically. But yeah, the population, I think, has spoken. We do a reemployment program where it's individuals who are on unemployment identified as likely to exhaust, meaning they're going to lose benefits or stay on too long, and we provide reemployment services to them. We used to always do that in person. Just before the pandemic in January, we started introducing a virtual reemployment and about 80% of people chose the virtual appointment versus the in-person appointment. So the tools exist. This only highlighted that they do exist, and so it's a matter of maximizing those, and I think the population's ready to shift. But again, accordingly, you have to respond with integrity efforts electronically to be able to meet that change to an electronic format.
Yeah. And Mark, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that. I think, it's the same thing from your state, right? The ability to try to address the more of a decentralized workforce and also start to move some stuff online that historically has been done in person. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on your side.
Oh no, we'd already started moving to a mostly online system before this happened, and I can't say enough about our IT department. I think a lot of things have been missed, and I'm pretty sure this is true in Utah also, and in most other states. The massive lift that Department of Labor's have done around the nation, when you're talking about development of software and processes that did not exist before, I think that's one of the things that has gotten lost in all of this. I mean, I think people don't realize the tremendous lift in the amazing work that has been done, not just here in Georgia, but around the nation by all these state departments. I don't think, when you take a look at all the things going on in the pandemic, I don't know what the actual percentage of it is, but it feels like 80% of all the relief that was asked to be put out there to the American public was asked to be done on the shoulders of Department of Labor's. And a lot of it was through new things and new programming, and getting this stuff off the ground in very short order is nothing short than a miracle.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, I mean that's one of the things that as we talk to a number of states that we found so impressive, right? Is the number of the level of effort that people put in to make the type of changes overnight that have actually allowed us to implement some of these policies. So I know we're out of time. I wanted to first of all thank our panelists. This was a great discussion. I think this could have gone on for another 2 hours. A lot of back and forth, a lot of lessons learned, it seems like, or concerns, ongoing concerns. Also, great advice on things that the federal government might be able to do better as we continue going forward, including, I think as Kevin mentioned, not necessarily trying to make dramatic changes over time here. I do know that we have some questions, and I apologize to those that submitted the questions. What I'd like to do is ask the panelists if I can submit those questions to you and then get your responses back sometime here in the near future, and then be able to get that back to the participants. I thank the participants. Hopefully this was valuable. This is an ongoing set of activities that we're all experiencing, but it's the kind of discussion that we had today that I think really lends well to being able to get better at what we're doing, whether it's from the policy perspective or it's the IT side of the world or what have you. So I want to thank everybody and obviously thank our host for this session. And I think that's all we have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.